Fairy tales are both stories of transformation and symbolic poetry. They are gifts from our ancestors, offering symbols and guidance for our human development. In this show, artist, philosopher, and teacher Sean Kramer will lead us into the imaginal realm of fairy tales, where we will find healing images and wise teachings for our own journey through this enchanted world. So welcome to Under Their Spell, meditating on fairy tales.
Welcome back, everyone, to our imaginative meditations and journeys through the world of fairy tales. And in today's meditation, we will journey with Max in the story Where the Wild Things Are, following and reflecting on his use of imagination to resolve inner conflicts and to grow as a child, as a human being. This story, Where the Wild Things Are, describes a little boy's efforts to resolve, to untie his inner conflicts that arise in his home life, in this case with his mother, to resolve them by taking an imaginative journey. So this particular story I see as a striking distillation of elements of fairy tales. It is a modern literary creation, not an oral tale like fairy tales, but it really brings out in a very clear way elements that are in fairy tales, and I think is very helpful for understanding better what fairy tales are and what they are doing. And this is a story very much about imagination and fantasy. And it shows us that in imagination and fantasy, there is an intentionality, a purpose, and that good stories and art can help our imaginations in that intentional process. So to begin, let us bring ourselves into a more relaxed, meditative state. Begin with some breathing and a visualization. So becoming aware of your breath. Let your breath be a tool for bringing your awareness into your body, into your inner feeling state at this time. With the in-breath, let your awareness come in, filling your body and observing the present sensations, emotions, places of tension, of relaxation, comfort, discomfort. And we will use a story, some imagery from the Bible as our visualization. So imagine yourself in a boat on the water. The water becomes troubled. The boat is rocking up and down. And in the boat, there is Jesus. And Jesus speaks to the water, "Be still." And the waters become calm. And you feel that calming of the waters. And your awareness extends outward, becoming one with the calm waters, the calmness of the air, the sky. And feel the sun, the light, the radiance of spirit, filling that whole space which is yourself, that calmness. In this story, there is a story landscape, so let's look first, as we have often done with our fairy tales, at the story map, the landscape of this story where the wild things are. Because it has a very similar, typical fairy tale landscape. The story begins in the boy named Max's home, and then in his room. Then he goes into a forest, and he takes a journey in a forest which goes through water to an island, and then he comes back to his room at home. And this is a typical threefold pattern of the fairy tale world: the home, the journey into the forest, and back home. Or something like a dark forest, an underworld or dark cave. And in this story of where the wild things are, it makes it very clear that for the boy, as he goes into the forest is his inner world, the world of his imagination, of fantasy, of dream. And just like when we go into our inner world, we see things growing there, arising like trees, images, dreams, thoughts. But we don't see their roots, the deep sources from which they are coming. But we feel them. We feel there are sources to our inner world, to our experience, to our very selves that are deeper than we can fathom or grasp, that are hidden in a kind of darkness and are revealing themselves through images and fantasy. And so this boy in his room goes into the forest of his own mysterious human self. We can combine this idea of the forest as the inner imaginative world with the insight we gained about imagination from the Cat in the Hat, which we looked at last time, which showed how figures of imagination, fantasy figures, are often the externalization or making sensible for us of inner parts of ourselves, parts which may be in conflict and are seeking some resolution. And fairy tales have that common three-part structure: home, forest, home. They also can be looked at as having a two-part structure, as tying the knot and untying the knot. That is, a beginning of the story that forms and intensifies a conflict or problem, and then unties or resolves that conflict. So we will go through the story of Where the Wild Things Are with both those structures in mind. The threefold structure of home, forest, imagination, and home, and also the idea that there's a conflict that gets formed and intensified and then resolved somehow. The story begins the night Max wore his wolf suit and made mischief of one kind or another. The story begins in the nighttime, already bringing us into the semi-conscious and unconscious world. And Max, the boy, is wearing his wolf suit. In the book, actually, the majority of the book is pictures. There are not that many words. Maurice Sendak, the writer of this book, was an illustrator, and he spent a lot of time illustrating other books, just being an artist making pictures before he started to write his own books. And he was very interested in images and imagination and their importance for human beings. And the first picture shows the little boy Max wearing his wolf suit with his pointy wolf ears and claws on his hands and feet. And he's got a hammer, and he has an angry face. He's hammering a nail into the wall. And there's also on the side a toy of his, looks like a little teddy bear hanging by a string. Ominous looking, like it's kind of an image of a hanging or an execution. The wolf suit is a wolf is a predatory animal, and it is a totem image of going way back to ancient, especially nomadic cultures, and of warrior cultures. Because it's a predator animal, warrior peoples identified themselves with it, because warrior cultures are predatory cultures. The ancient, even the first civilizations in the Middle East, the Egyptians and the Assyrians, identified themselves with predatory animals. And in their art, they would picture the king killing lions. And lions are on the top of the predatory chain. So the image of a human being and the chief human being, the king who represents the human community, killing a lion is showing that the human is the top predator of all. The human as king means it's the top predator, like the king of the beasts, the lion, but the human kills the lion. And this was a ritual in these early civilizations. It was a ritual of the king killing a lion, and most of the lions in the Middle East were killed off in this way because they used this as a ritual. And Max is connecting with this aspect of human nature that we have that is in many ways troubling to us, to ourselves. Our own being part of a species and having this nature of a species that is the top predator on the planet Earth, which sometimes we would like to suppress and deny in our consciousness, that aspect of what we are, that predatory, wild, violent aspect. In the very next picture of Max wearing his wolf suit and making mischief in his house, the picture is of Max chasing the family dog down the stairs with a fork, chasing the dog, wanting to stick a fork into the dog. The dog is the tamed wolf, and Max here is the wild wolf, and he is acting as a predator to his tame, domesticated wolf dog of the family pet. This story of Maurice Sendak was actually troubling to people when it first came out in the early 1960s. That some libraries at first tried to ban the book. For one reason, this portrayal, which to us might seem strange, but it shows that reluctance we have to see this violent, predatory aspect of ourselves, and that is being enacted by this little boy and is part of little children, and maybe a little more often of little boys. One author said that every new generation of humans is another invasion of the barbarians into civilization, and they need to be tamed and cultivated, or they will destroy civilization. We as humans like to project this violent side of ourselves out onto particular groups, as if they're just certain evil people like Hitler or the Nazis who are somehow, or demons who contain this destructive power. But in fact, it's part of being a human. and it's part of what we are. And it's something that we need to see and work with, and which this story is about. What to do with this part of ourselves and the insight of that. The writer Alice Miller said that the first rejection that all of us experience as little children is from our parents who want a nice little boy or girl, but actually get this explosive, creative star being sent from the depths of the universe into their lives, but they would rather a nice little boy or girl, and we all feel that rejection of certain tremendous, both violent and creative parts of ourselves, and we also reject much of ourselves. So this story will help us see what that means, to accept parts of ourselves, in this case the aggressive, violent, predatory sides of ourselves. Does not mean to simply fully act it out or let it take over the whole of us, because it is not the whole of us. It is a part. But instead of letting the part take over the whole or cutting out a part of ourselves, we want to, and this story is trying to give us a picture of how to bring that part into a whole. So Max is running around the house with claws, a fork, a tool of eating after the family dog. And the story goes on, and his mother called him Wild Thing. And Max said, "I'll eat you up." So he was sent to bed without eating anything. His mother calls him Wild Thing, and symbolically we can see the conflict between a certain symbolic aspect of the mother and the female and the male. The mother side, which is a side of human nature also, is the caring, nurturing side. Also can be seen as the more domesticating, taming side. And she calls the boy Wild Thing. This aggressive boy who's showing aggressive, violent, fighting behavior. It's interesting in light of our recent election. Someone made the comment that the contest between the two American candidates, which was a female against a male, was pitting the devouring mother against the tyrannical father. One side was, and group of people in our culture are emphasizing the caring, nurturing side, wanting the government to take care of people, welfare, health care, welcoming. And the other side, more defensive, aggressive, fighting, defending, protecting side. And I've noticed this sometimes between mothers and little boys. Not that it's universal, but I have seen it with one single mother. I was with her at the park with her little boy, and these older teenage boys came to the park, and they were moving around on the swings and pushing each other around. Nothing inappropriately violent, but just acting like teenage boys. And the mother said, "I don't like how teenage boys play. It makes me uncomfortable." And I've seen sometimes that mothers or female caretakers of boys can be troubled by the behaviors of boys, some that needs to be brought in line or socialized, but some is simply expressing an aspect of being a boy that the female doesn't experience in the same way. The way little boys like to play is often acting out more the aggressive and fighting, violent, predatory aspect of our human nature. And it gets very deep, because if we ask why humans in human history are violent, among the many reasons, one is that the universe is violent, and we came from the universe. Our very matter, our molecules, the elements that make us up, came from what is the most violent thing in the whole universe, a dying, exploding star, a supernova. It takes that act of violence. A supernova will annihilate everything around it. When our star sun dies, that will be the end of the Earth and the planets and the solar system. But that actually gave creative birth to the elements that then went on to make the whole wonderful life that we see on this planet Earth. And that's something that is difficult to make sense of. Maybe impossible to fully make sense of with our human minds. Jane Goodall, who studied the apes, she discovered, but then was troubled enough that she didn't reveal it for a long time, the violence among the chimps. She had the idea when she went to study them that nature was less violent, the primates would be less violent, and that human culture had developed violently. And she saw that the primates themselves in the state of nature were in fact violent, aggressive, and some primates will kill each other and even gather into bands and have wars. And even humans, we had this myth of the primitive, more peaceful people. And by in fact studying and observing, we find that more tribal cultures that seem closer to, might say, the state of nature are more violent, proportionate-wise. There's more killings than there are among civilized cultural peoples. So civilization, in fact, tames violence, even though we've built up weapons of greater power. And Max says, "I'll eat you up," and he is sent to bed without eating anything. And there enters into the story this aspect of feeding and eating, which again is part of this experience of within the universe and within ourselves and our own life of predation, violence, creativity coming from death and destruction. We live by feeding off other beings, which involves destroying them. Even if you're a vegetarian, you must live through the destruction of other living things. And humans in their rituals and art have been very aware and sensitive to this. And it's part of religious ritual, eating and sacrifice. This mystery of life, beings feeding off other beings, and life coming from death and destruction. And Max says to his mother, "I'll eat you up," but she sends him to bed without eating. When Max says, "I'll eat you up," as a predator, there's one side of it is, "I'll kill you." And children and parents do have feelings of killing each other or getting rid of each other. And in fact, sometimes that is acted out. Sometimes children do kill their parents and parents do kill their children. There is a very real, serious level of conflict that has the potential of mutual destruction, even in this very sacred, nurturing, most archetypally loving relationship of a mother and a child. And some peoples, or in some traditions, are so troubled with this process of eating, feeding, life, death, destruction, recreation, that they develop practices to try to allow humans to completely escape from that, to escape from this world of samsara, it's sometimes called, the world of this mutual destruction and rebirth. So the story goes on. That very night in Max's room, a forest grew. And we see in the pictures that in Max's room there begin to grow trees, plants, until his room is gone, and there is an entire forest. And this is, as the story later even makes clear when he comes back, this is Max entering into his imagination. J.R. Tolkien said that fairy tales, the author of Lord of the Rings, he said fairy tales are not really about the supernatural or magic. The strange things that happen in fairy tales that can't happen in the real world are based in the capacity of the human imagination to combine things in ways that they aren't in the real world. So in the real world, we don't see glass mountains, but we can combine that in our imagination. We can make a glass mountain and have a fairy tale where a princess sits on top of a glass mountain and princes have to ride their horses up to see who can get up to the princess on the glass mountain. In the real world, girls don't take body parts and fit them back together like Fisher's bird and so that they sit up again and reawaken. But that can happen in our imagination. The human imagination takes things from the outer world and is able to recombine them. So Tolkien said that fairy tales are not really trying to tell us about some supernatural world or magic powers. They're rooted in the very nature of human imagination, and they're taking us into our imaginations. So that very night in Max's room, a forest grew and grew and grew until his ceiling hung with vines and the walls became the world all around. And an ocean tumbled by with a private boat for Max, and he sailed off through almost over a year to where the wild things are. Now the story alters space and time. The room becomes a forest, and in Max's journey, time is altered. He sails through night and day, in and out of weeks, over a year. But as we know from the end, it's in the outer world, it's been very little time. And this changing of space and time tells us that we're leaving the world of ordinary reality and going into the inner psychic world of human beings. That we have this multifaceted experience of life that contains an outer and an inner world. And as far as we know, the most complex, developed, mysterious inner world, inner experience that any living being has. And going into the forest, or in other fairy tales, going into caves or an underworld, it is suggested to us that we are entering into areas which are normally hidden from us. And that something from that hidden realm is going to be revealed to us. And in the altered time, we are told that we're entering into unconscious processes that are connected with ancient, archaic, that have given rise to what and who we are. And then Max goes over an ocean which can have the association of the feelings and the emotions, which when we enter into this world of feelings, emotions, it's like tides and swells, and with its own weather of turbulence and calm. He moves away from the shore, away from the stable, known, ordered, on an exploration into what is less known, ordered, more chaotic and mysterious. And he gets to where the wild things are. And when he came to the place, the story continues, where the wild things are, they roared their terrible roars and gnashed their terrible teeth and rolled their terrible eyes and showed their terrible claws. So Max has entered into himself, and this child is feeling this deep well of, the word is repeated many times, of terror, terribleness, of roars and teeth and aggressive, frightening eyes and claws of threatening predators. The poet Rainer Maria Rilke wrote that someone advised him to go and enter in and reconnect with his inner child. And as if it was kind of a happy, joyous thing, your inner child, your playfulness, and he went in and reconnected with his inner child, and he said the experiences was, for him, of things became more frightening. He said the little threads coming out of the blankets, the wool on his bed were sharp, and things were sharp and pointed and dangerous. And he had this heightened sensitivity that he was recalling from his childhood to that aspect of the world we come into, which is the aspect kind of outside the safety of the nourishing mother. So Max is meeting this, and when Max is there and he sees the wild things, Max says, "Be still." And he tamed them with the magic trick of staring into all their yellow eyes without blinking once. And they were frightened and called him the most wild thing of all, and made him king of all the wild things. And here this echoes this imagery in human culture and art of the human as the most wild, predatory, conquering animal on earth, but also the aspect of the kingliness of stilling the wild things, of ruling over the wild things. Here we have another archetypal fairy tale image of becoming a king. In fairy tales, often the journey of the protagonist, often a young boy or girl, young man or woman, ends with them becoming a king or a queen. Sometimes that's interpreted as a reflection of the culture, society from which the tales came from, as if they came from times and places where there were kings and queens, and it's expressing the peasants' envious desire that they could rise up the social ladder. But this story tells us that that's not right at all, because this story was written in America in the 1960s, and there were no kings and queens in that culture, as there are not now. But the king or queen still has a deep resonance. It's the inner king and queen. And in the picture, we see Max with a crown and a scepter, and the wild things bowing down before him. "And now," cried Max, "let the wild rumpus start." And we see in the pictures Max and the wild things dancing, howling, and clawing up to the moon like wild dogs and wolves. Then they're swinging on trees, and then Max is on top of the wild thing with his crown and scepter. They're dancing through the night forest. "Now stop," Max said, and sent the wild things off to bed without their supper. And here we see how Max in his imagination is, as a child, is working through his inner conflict and what it means to become a king in fairy tales. Max is taking rule over this part of these wild things that are parts of himself, of his nature. He isn't destroying them, but he is able to rule over them. He's able to tell them, okay, now be wild, let the wild rumpus start, and they can express their wildness. But he's also able to say, stop, and they stop. This is the meaning of the king in fairy tales. When someone becomes a king or a queen, it signifies a level of maturity where they are able to rule over themselves, acquire a self-rule or a self-parenting. And Max, the king of all the wild things, we could say the human, the king of all the wild things on earth, was lonely and wanted to be where someone loved him best of all. Here Max, in his imagination, is following out possible directions that his life and energies could take. And he sees that he could follow out his wildness and simply live it all out. But if he did, he would become lonely. He would be unfit for society if he simply let the wild things in him control himself, have their way. And there's another story that expresses this in another way by Shakespeare's play Richard III, is about a man who climbs his way to the top of the dominance hierarchy of his time in England. He becomes king by ruthlessly killing off, manipulating, lying. He consciously chooses to let the wild, dark, violent sides of himself guide his life, and he achieves his goal. He's the top predator, and in an amazing scene at the end, Shakespeare goes into his mind, and Richard, before he dies, realizes that though everyone is submitting to him, that there's nobody who loves him. There's not a single person who actually loves him. Everyone hates him. And he tries to console himself. He says, well, at least I love myself. And as he thinks further, he realizes, no, I don't even love myself. I hate myself. And that's the end of someone who does not achieve a self-rule, an ultimate loneliness, lack of love, and finally even a disconnection from themselves. So Max is in this process discovering another part of himself, maybe even a deeper part of himself that seeks love, community, relationship, and that requires that he achieve a level of self-rule, that he comes to acknowledge all parts of himself, but puts an order into them, that he can say, be wild, now stop, be quiet, be still. So here we see a function of the human imagination. In evolution, part of the process of creativity is an exploring random mutation. So a bacteria or virus, in order to adapt to its environment, will create multiple replicas, but with random mutations, and one of them will be more adapted. And then the organism can continue adapted to its environment. That's part of the inner creativity and exploration of the universe, moving toward its goal. But that's very costly. But if you have a virus or bacteria that can replicate over and over, they just sacrifice many so that one can go forward and evolve. But in the human being, this process has become internalized. And it occurs in our imagination, so that instead of just letting humans try out things and try out the path of King Richard and find out that that's a dead end and it leads to loneliness and misery, we can play that out in our imagination. It's like creating a replica of ourselves and seeing what would happen if it went down that path. And if it gets destroyed, which our ideas and plans often do in our mind, well, then we don't have to go there. We can go another way. So our imagination has internalized the exploratory evolutionary process of trying out many mutations and finding which is the best adaptation. So Max in his mind is seeing what would happen if he simply followed out his wildness. He would become a lonely, isolated, sad, self-hating human being. So now he doesn't have to go through that. He understands that there's a different path. And if we experience the plays of Shakespeare, like of King Richard, what we're doing is learning, like an organism replicating itself and finding out which adaptation is better. But we can do that with our mind and imagination. It's an amazing invention of the universe that humans can, with their imagination, explore multiple evolutionary possible paths, and then instead of killing off many humans, we just kill off those ideas and we find the other way. And the fairy tales do that. They show possible journeys of humans and show us the successful and unsuccessful ones. Such as in Mother Hala, it tells about two girls who journey through the underworld, and one is productive, conscientious, helpful, the other's lazy, and we see the consequences without ourselves having to try out those destructive paths. So this story exemplifies and shows us part of what imagination is about and what it can be when it's functioned properly, and what the real creative geniuses have given us through their stories. They've given us tools so that this evolutionary function of human imagination can work better, more creatively, and less destructively. Then the story goes on, then all around from far away across the world he smelled good things to eat. So he gave up being king of where the wild things are. But the wild things cried, "Oh, please don't go. We'll eat you up. We love you so." And Max said, no. He's making a choice now, a conscious choice to resolve this inner conflict. Then the wild things roared their terrible roars and gnashed their terrible teeth and rolled their terrible eyes and showed their terrible claws. But Max stepped into his private boat and waved goodbye and sailed back over a year and in and out of weeks and through a day. And into the night of his very own room, where he found his supper waiting for him. And it was still hot. And there in that last phrase, Sendak brings so many things together and also awakens us more clearly to the fact that this has been a journey of Max into his inner world, into his imagination. And as we look at the story as a whole, we notice how the inner world of where the wild things are was paralleling the outer world of his family life, as we've seen so many times in fairy tales. Like in Hansel and Gretel, when they go into the forest, they find the nourishing cake house, like the mother they want, having a witch inside, just like in the outer world, their mother, from whom they sought love, was cruel and devouring and wanting to kill them. So in this story, where the wild things are, we see that in the inner world of the forest, there are all these parallels to the outer world. So Max sends the wild things to bed without their supper, just as his mother did. And there he is starting to internalize his mother's perspective. Instead of seeing it as an outer imposing authority, he imagines it and starts to see what the reasons are. He sees it from his mother's perspective so that he can integrate that into himself. In that way, further resolving his inner conflict. So to finish up our meditation, I'll just finish with a little story from Maurice Sendak, that he said that he once received a letter from a little boy who was a fan, and in reply he wrote back a letter to the boy with a little drawing of one of the wild things. And he got a letter back from the little boy's mother. And the mother said that my little boy, Jim, loved your card so much, that Maurice Sendak sent him. He loved your card so much that he ate it. And the author, Maurice Sendak, said that was one of the best compliments I ever received. The little boy didn't care that he had received an original drawing or anything. He just saw And so, Selimon, do we have any comments or questions?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
We had a good one from Claudia. She asked, could the forest be real to some people but not to other people? Can something be real for you but no one else?
I would say that the forest is real. I mean, the inner world is real, but it is a different kind of world. But I do believe that Sendak sends many signals to us that he's writing about a child and what it's like for a child going into their room and then going into the world of their imagination. So that's how I see it.
Good. That was the only question that we had for today.
Okay. Okay, so shall we finish with our meditation?
I would like that.
Okay. So coming to the present through our bodies and their actual sensations in the present, we link ourselves to the moment, our bodies as the mediators between the outer world and our inner world. And as we experience in our lives conflicts, struggles, we notice also, as Max did, somewhere there is an abiding, loving, caring presence. Through all his journey with the wild things, there was a caring, loving mother bringing him his food, offering him love and reconciliation. So the universe that we are in, that contains frightening wild things, all the while at the very deeper level is a universe permeated by and originated by a source of love and caring for every part of the universe, including each one of us.